gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied. 'Your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
Parable that we've all heard many times. And sometimes hearing things over and over again, it just gets repetitive. So it's important for us to pause long enough to take time to hear again and to perhaps hear in some different insights and understandings. The prodigal son, or lost son, was an abuser of grace. It might sound like a harsh statement, but I want you to hold on to that idea as we think through what happened. Grace is most often defined as unmerited or unearned favor. He had a loving father, a good home, provision, a future, and an inheritance, but he traded it all for temporal pleasures. The parable of the prodigal son, or the lost son, is found in this New Testament passage in Luke 15. And it is the third of 3 parables in that chapter directed at a mixed audience of tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, the religious leaders, and teachers of the law. All 3 parables are on the topic of lost things being found. A lost sheep, a lost coin, a lost son. Likewise, all three parables point to the heavenly joy over every sinner who repents and turns to Jesus. Jesus had his specific audience at this time, a mix of sinners and righteous, in mind when he told those three stories. Jesus was prompted to tell these parables because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were accusing him of welcoming sinners. That's a terrible thing to do, isn't it? And eating with them, sitting at table with sinners. Oh my goodness. Well, clearly, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law viewed themselves as righteous, and the other half of the audience as sinners. Jesus told the stories of the lost sheep and the coin and the son to clear up the matter of who is truly lost. So, who was the prodigal? What is the story? We've just heard the scripture lesson in its typical framework, or at least the one that we typically hear it in. And I don't mean to go through it all over again as such, but to touch on points of it with perhaps a different insight. The younger son. Many of us perhaps have included or had the insight that this is the focus of the parable, partly because it takes up the largest portion of the story. But many have also concluded that this parable is primarily about the older son rather than the young son who left home. The older son had been faithfully working in the fields for his father. Seeing his father celebrating the return of his rebellious brother, he felt angry and refused to join the celebrations. His father pleaded with his older son to try to understand his joy over the return of what he had lost. And it was like this younger son had been dead and was alive again, that he had been lost and now was found. But before we conclude the story and tie it up there, let us just hear a little bit of a different idea. Harold L. Sankville, in his book, The Care of Souls, that I've been reading recently, and I'm not through it yet, had a wonderful piece in the middle of this writing. And he shares an insightful learning from this parable. He refers to Helmut Thielicke's title for this parable as The Waiting Father. He's a man with two sons. The eldest stays home to work on the family farm. The youngest sets out to seek his fortune. There's just one hitch. He imprudently demands his share of the inheritance and then proceeds to waste all the assets his father gave him on reckless living. But the boy soon finds himself in a desperate straits. He's hired on with a hog farm tending pigs. You can't get much more desperate if you're a Jewish boy with no options other than to work among unclean animals. The last straw came when he found himself looking enviously at the hog trough. When pig slop began to look good to him, he knew he had reached rock bottom. That's when he decided to go back to his father's house, and he knew he had done wrong. He had sinned against both God and his father. And his sin not only resulted in guilt, but it also brought a heavy dose of shame. This man had a heavy sense of unworthiness. He felt deep in his bones that his brash rebellion had disqualified him from sonship. He even rehearsed that little speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. That's what shame feels like. It strikes the very core of your being and radically alters your sense of identity. He knew he was had not only wronged his father, but he had failed him as a son. I love the way Jesus tells this story. As the boy trudges on doggedly back towards his home, we learn that the father had been waiting all along, anxiously scanning the horizon for his beloved son. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him, it says in Scripture, and he felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. We hear that in Luke 15. The dejected boy began the sad little speech. Father, I have sinned against you and against heaven. This was the voice of guilt talking. It confesses wrongs committed. But then he went on. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That was the voice of shame speaking. It speaks of wounds suffered. Remember, guilt has to do with behavior, and shame has to do with being and identity. If you've experienced either of those, you know that impact. But the father would have none of it. Although the son had wandered far away from his father's house and squandered every vestige of his inheritance, his father's embrace told him he was forgiven. Dressed and adorned as a son, he knew he had come home again. So despite the diverse audience, Jesus was speaking directly to all of these religious leaders, teachers of the law, and everyone who reads the parable in every age. He is aiming straight into the darkness of their hearts, pleading with them to lay aside their trust in their own righteousness and works. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not of yourself. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. It's one of the things that many in the church struggle with. I've paid my dues. I've spent my time. I've offered my abilities. I've paid for my membership. It means nothing to God. It's a sad statement, but it's a true statement. Grace alone is what opens the door to salvation. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were trusting in a work-based religion. Rather than experience salvation by God's grace through their faith, the older brother, and in this parable, and others, they viewed themselves as worthy sons. I'm worthy of God's love. unless we see ourselves as unworthy, like the younger son. We cannot possibly fall upon the grace of God unless we realize that we are spiritually destitute. We will never be saved. It is only the needy who reach out for help and to be saved. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The definition of prodigal, Merriam-Webster in our modern day, gives us two senses of the definition of prodigal. One who spends or gives lavishly or foolishly, or one who returns after an absence. Our sermons can often focus on the younger brother, the brother who physically ran away from home, and often we hear the parable. Perhaps we can identify with one or two of these characters. Maybe we're like the older brother who snubs the grace given to him by the Father. Even though he was home, he was never truly home. He was there in his mind, under duress to do the right things in order to get the inheritance. And when the party starts, he refuses to go in to celebrate the return of the lost son. Or perhaps we identify more with that younger son. Like him, we have squandered our wealth or run away from our home or from our home of faith, the church, or at least as much as we possibly thought we could. Some of us may even identify with the father figure in the story. Maybe we have family members who have gone astray